The lives of Alex and Margaret appeared perfect to everyone around them. They met while studying law at university, and soon after graduation, they got married. Their friends and family always saw them as the ideal couple. Alex was an ambitious attorney rapidly climbing the career ladder, while Margaret preferred a quieter life as a real estate lawyer. Their lives were built on plans, career goals, and dreams for the future. But over time, things began to change. Alex spent more and more time at work, neglecting his relationship with his wife. Their once strong bond started to fracture. Margaret, feeling lonely and neglected, tried to talk to him, expressing how much she missed warmth and care in their relationship. But Alex simply brushed off her concerns, claiming he was doing all this for their future. His work hours stretched longer, and weekends became another opportunity to meet clients or finish cases. Eventually, their life together turned into a formality. They lived in the same house but seemed to be in different worlds. Gradual conflicts and emotional distance led to the inevitable divorce. Margaret filed first, unable to endure Alex's coldness and indifference anymore, but Alex couldn't accept it. He couldn't stand the idea that Margaret wanted to leave him. To him, it was a personal blow, not only as a man but as someone used to controlling everything. After the divorce, Margaret rented a small apartment in the city center. She decided to start fresh, focusing on her career and well-being. Alex, on the other hand, couldn't let her go. He felt abandoned and humiliated, especially when he saw how quickly Margaret adapted to her new life. He became more intrusive, constantly trying to find out what she was doing and who she was seeing. At first, it was just persistent phone calls under the pretense of needing to discuss something about their affairs. Later, it turned into accidental encounters near her office. As months went by, Alex grew more obsessive. He would show up at her home late at night, waiting outside her building, saying he needed to talk. When Margaret asked him to leave her alone, he would just smirk and say they had unfinished business. His behavior grew increasingly disturbing. She began noticing him following her on the street, appearing in places she had never seen him before. Eventually, Margaret began fearing for her safety. She changed her phone number, installed cameras in her apartment, and even considered going to the police. But Alex was careful. He never crossed the line or directly threatened her. His actions always looked like mere coincidences. The police couldn't do much, as technically Alex wasn't breaking any laws. However, everything changed when Margaret discovered she was pregnant. This news shocked her. She had dreamed of having a child for a long time, but she and Alex had never taken that step. Now, with them divorced, she never expected fate to give her this chance, but joy quickly turned to fear. Once Alex learned about her pregnancy, his behavior became even more unpredictable. He found out about the pregnancy by accident through mutual friends. For him, it was a breaking point. Thoughts of this child representing a new life that would exclude him from Margaret's entirely began to take root in his mind. Alex started to see the child as the ultimate barrier to reclaiming control over her life. At first, Alex simply increased his harassment. He began appearing at her house more frequently, sending messages hinting that she should move back or reconsider things with him. There was a growing sense of threat in his words. He would say that the child would grow up fatherless if she didn't take him back. Margaret was terrified. She realized Alex was becoming dangerous, but proving his threats or convincing the police to intervene was almost impossible. One evening, on her way home, Margaret noticed someone following her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Alex. His face was contorted with hatred and jealousy. He quickened his pace, and instinctively she began walking faster too. Her apartment was only a few minutes away, and she ducked into a nearby store to try to shake him off. These instances of stalking started happening more frequently. Alex seemed obsessed. Margaret understood that every day she left her home might be her last peaceful day. She started avoiding outings, rarely leaving home, and even kept to herself around her neighbors. Her life became a constant loop of fear. Meanwhile, Alex only intensified his efforts. He was certain that if he frightened her enough, she would eventually give in and take him back. But his intentions had taken on a darker turn. Jealousy, rage, and a sense of betrayal filled his mind. He felt that the child was the last obstacle to regaining power over Margaret. Margaret tried not to succumb to panic, but it all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Every time she came home, she felt as if Alex was watching her. She began avoiding her usual routes, changing her schedule, but nothing seemed to shake the feeling of being constantly monitored. For Alex, on the other hand, each day made him feel more confident. He knew all of Margaret's routines and habits, where she went and when. Now his goal wasn't just to win her back, but to destroy her new life completely. Margaret's pregnancy was the final insult to his ego. He couldn't let her have a child and live happily with someone else, without him. Dark thoughts crossed his mind more and more often. He was convinced that the only way forward was to remove her from his life for good. One morning, Margaret found her car damaged. It had happened overnight and she hadn't noticed it immediately. Only when she went to work did she see deep scratches across the body and a broken headlight. A new wave of fear washed over her. She knew Alex had done this, but she had no way to prove it. The police told her once again that there wasn't enough evidence to open a case. Without threats or direct actions, there was nothing they could do. Margaret felt increasingly vulnerable. It seemed like Alex was in every step she took, observing her every move. She even considered moving to another city, but she knew it would only be a temporary measure. Alex would find her anywhere. One day she met with a friend and decided to confide in her about everything. Margaret's friend was shocked that she had endured this harassment for so long and still hadn't tried to get a restraining order. "Margaret, you have to do something," her friend insisted. "He's becoming more dangerous. You can't keep living in constant fear. Try going to court for a restraining order. It might be the only way to force him to stay away." Margaret knew her friend was right, but she also understood that it wouldn't truly solve the problem. Alex was stubborn and cunning. She had no doubt he would find a way around any order and continue to monitor her, threatening her safety. She decided to file for the restraining order, but kept thinking about disappearing and hiding. Shortly after that, her life took a turn. She received a call from the police. Officers informed her that Alex had tried to access her information through their database, using his position at the law firm. They warned her that he might become more aggressive and advised her to be extremely cautious. This news only heightened her fear. Margaret began to think that Alex would stop at nothing. She started looking for ways to quickly change her location and disappear. But time was running out. Margaret frequently woke up at night in terror. She felt as if someone was standing outside her door or watching her through the window. She installed extra locks, but it brought no relief. Alex had become more than just her ex-husband. He was now a living nightmare, controlling her life. One night, hearing a rustling outside her window, Margaret got up and cautiously peeked out. She was sure it was Alex coming again to frighten her. Her heart was pounding so loudly she thought she might lose control of her emotions. But there was no one outside. It was only her imagination, yet it didn't make the situation any less terrifying. She could no longer feel safe, even in her own home. The next few days passed in constant tension. Margaret kept thinking about how to escape Alex, but she knew that, despite all the precautions, he would always find a way to get close to her. He knew her too well, knew all her vulnerabilities, which made him even more dangerous. When her friend insisted once again that she go to court for an order, Margaret agreed. She had nothing left to lose except her fear. She contacted a lawyer, explained the situation, and after a few weeks, she was granted a restraining order. This was supposed to be some guarantee of her safety. However, Alex took this as a personal insult. The order only fueled his hatred and jealousy. He understood that Margaret would never come back to him, but he couldn't accept the idea of her living peacefully and raising a child without him. Thoughts began to flood his mind that the only way to stop her was to take her life. Then he would finally regain control. Alex started making a plan. He knew he couldn't simply barge into her home. That would be too risky, but he knew where she went and her habits, and one evening, he decided to act. Margaret came home after a long day, and as usual, got involved in her household chores. Alex knew she lived alone and expected no obstacles. His hatred for his ex-wife had reached its peak. He had been watching her for weeks, studying every detail of her life, and now, finally, the moment came when he decided he couldn't wait any longer. Every day turned into a survival game for Margaret. She constantly looked over her shoulder, checking to see if Alex was nearby. Sometimes she thought her paranoia had gone too far, but then things would happen that confirmed her fears. She started noticing small details indicating that Alex continued watching her. A scratched door lock, footprints on the landing, even though the building was always clean. Margaret knew she had to take action, but each attempt to seek help encountered legal formalities and a lack of direct evidence. Her friend advised her to stay with relatives for a while, but Margaret felt this wouldn't solve the problem. Alex was too stubborn and too obsessed. One night she heard a strange sound near the window. Her heart froze and she couldn't believe it was happening again. She cautiously approached the window, trying not to make sudden moves that would reveal her presence. When she carefully peeked behind the curtain, she thought she saw someone hiding in the shadows of the trees. She froze in terror and cold sweat began to trickle down her back. The night passed in a state of anxiety. Margaret couldn't sleep, constantly thinking that her life could end at any moment. She began wondering if she should even leave her home. Each night her fear grew, and she more often thought that Alex truly intended to kill her. Her pregnancy complicated the situation. She understood that she had to protect not only herself, but also her future child. This realization gave her strength, but also increased her sense of vulnerability. Alex seemed to just be beginning his game, and Margaret was desperately searching for a way out of the situation. His hatred for his ex-wife had reached its peak. He had been following her for weeks, studying every detail of her life, and now finally the moment came when he decided he couldn't wait any longer. It was a typical autumn evening. Margaret came home from work a bit later than usual, as she had decided to stop by the grocery store. She still felt Alex's presence but tried not to give in to fear. She thought that if she continued living her life without showing that she was afraid, maybe he would finally leave her alone. However, she only had a little more time to live in this illusion of safety. Alex sat in his car, parked a short distance from her house, watching as she loaded her groceries into the car and headed toward the entrance to her building. His heart pounded with hatred and adrenaline. He knew this was his chance. He waited a few minutes until she entered the house, then quietly stepped out of his car and made his way toward her home. When Margaret unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside, she felt a wave of relief. She hadn't seen Alex all day, giving her a false sense of security. She set her bags down on the kitchen table and headed toward the bedroom to change. Nothing warned her of what was to come. Meanwhile, Alex was already outside her door. He knew she lived alone and that no one would come to help her. Using the spare key he had secretly made when they were still married, he quietly unlocked the door and slipped inside. Margaret had no idea that danger was already lurking within. She had just changed into her comfortable clothes when she heard a faint sound in the hallway. It was a barely perceptible creak of the door, and at first she thought it was just her imagination. But a few seconds later, as she heard soft footsteps, her heart stopped. She froze in place, listening to every movement. Cautiously, she approached her bedroom door and cracked it open slightly. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Alex was standing in the hallway holding a knife, his eyes burning with hatred. Her panic quickly turned to terror. She knew there was nowhere to run, no help coming. "Alex, what are you doing here?" Her voice shook, but she tried to remain calm. "You know exactly why I'm here." His voice was cold and steady, as if he had already made up his mind. "You thought you could just get rid of me? That I let you live, have a child, and be happy without me?" Margaret took a step back, trying to gauge her chances of escape. She knew there was no point in reasoning with him. Alex had long since lost control of himself. All she could do was try to stall, hoping for some slim chance to survive. "Alex, please think about it. This won't solve anything. You'll only make things harder for yourself." She tried to appeal to him, though she knew it was futile. His face twisted with rage, and he took a step toward her. "I don't care about my life, Margaret." His voice was filled with fury. "You destroyed me, and now I'm going to destroy you." Margaret tried to back away, but soon she felt the cold wall behind her. She had nowhere left to run. She looked at the knife in his hand and realized her chances of survival were slipping away with each passing second. In that moment, fear gave way to pure survival instinct. She knew that if she didn't act now, she might not get another chance. She dashed toward the door, hoping to make it out of the room, but Alex was faster. He grabbed her by the arm and violently shoved her to the floor. Margaret cried out in pain as she hit the edge of the nightstand, but her body moved on autopilot. She tried to get up, but Alex was already standing over her, the knife poised in his hand. "You left me no choice," he murmured, raising his hand to strike. In that moment, panicked, Margaret grabbed the nearest object, a small lamp on the nightstand, and struck Alex's hand with all her strength. The lamp shattered, and Alex yelped, momentarily losing control. It was her only chance. Realizing her life hung by a thread, Margaret instinctively darted to the nearest room and slammed the door shut behind her. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding wildly. She knew the door wouldn't hold if Alex decided to break it down. Time was running out. "Alex, please stop!" She screamed from behind the door, desperately searching for any way out of the room, but finding nothing. There were no windows, making her situation even more hopeless. Outside the door, she could hear Alex's footsteps, his heavy breathing, and the eerie rhythmic tapping of the knife against the doorknob. Margaret knew she had only moments before he would break through. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the front door. "Hey, is everything all right in there?" It was Mr. Richardson, her neighbor. The old man's voice was laced with concern. "I heard yelling. Open up. Please call the police." Margaret shouted from behind the closed door, realizing this was her only chance at salvation. Alex froze for a moment, his attention drawn to the front door, where the neighbor continued to knock. His face twisted in anger as he realized that if someone called the police, his plans would be ruined. Without hesitation, he moved toward the front door. "Is everything okay?" The voice outside was now more insistent. Alex opened the door swiftly, and Mr. Richardson stood there, clearly worried. The old man didn't have time to register the danger before Alex ruthlessly plunged the knife into his chest. The man gasped, his eyes widening with pain and shock as his body began to slump to the floor. Without wasting a moment, Alex dragged the neighbor's body inside the apartment and shut the door behind him. Blood left dark stains on the floor, but Alex was focused on his next target. He slowly turned back toward the room where Margaret was hiding. Her cries for help had signaled to him that time was running out. Someone else might have heard her or noticed something suspicious. His breathing was heavy, his face distorted with hatred as he approached the door, slamming his shoulder into it. "Alex, please stop!" Margaret screamed again, her voice filled with terror, but Alex was beyond any control now. He struck the door again, and it began to splinter. A few more blows and the door gave way. Alex burst into the room, his eyes shining with madness. "You thought you could hide?" He snarled, raising the knife. Margaret backed into the corner of the room, desperately searching for something to defend herself, but it was useless. She knew the end was near. "Please," she managed to whisper, looking at him in horror, but Alex was beyond hearing her. He lunged forward, plunging the knife deep into her chest. Margaret screamed, but the sound quickly faded. Her body slumped to the floor and blood began to spread across the hardwood. Alex stood over her, his chest heaving with rage and adrenaline. He looked at the knife still in his hand and finally comprehended what he had just done. The room fell silent, broken only by his heavy breathing. As Alex stood over Margaret's body, his mind slowly returned to the reality of what he had committed. The blood pooling on the floor was the last evidence of his hatred, his revenge, but alongside the feeling of triumph, another feeling began to creep in. Panic. He had just killed 2 people, and he knew he would have to run. He moved quickly, though not entirely consciously. First, he wiped the knife on Margaret's shirt and slipped it into his pocket. Her phone, lying on the kitchen table, was smashed. He'd done that earlier to prevent her from calling the police. He scanned the room, trying not to leave too many traces, but he knew he was running out of time. He bolted out of the apartment, locking the door behind him. He had a plan: to hide out for a while at his old friend Carl's place. Carl lived on the other side of town and was the kind of person who didn't ask too many questions. Alex knew he could borrow Carl's car and move around unnoticed. When Alex showed up at Carl's door, muttering something about an urgent trip, Carl, unaware of what had happened, handed over the keys to his old sedan. Alex took the car and drove to the outskirts, deciding to lie low. For several weeks he lived a nightmare, hiding out in cheap motels, trying not to draw attention. He constantly checked the news and social media, dreading that his name might soon appear in police reports. Despite all his efforts, the fear and tension grew. Alex knew that eventually the police would start looking for him, but for now, everything was quiet. Margaret and her neighbor were dead, and he was certain the police had no leads linking him to the crimes. However, after a month of tense hiding, just as he was beginning to believe he might have escaped justice, the unexpected happened. One evening, as he drove down a quiet suburban street in Carl's car, he saw police lights flashing behind him. "Damn," Alex muttered, feeling his heart race. He had been careful on the road these past few weeks, but today he was caught by pure chance. Carl's car had a broken turn signal and the officers had pulled him over for a routine check. Alex knew it might be nothing, just a simple stop, but his nerves were on edge. Pulling over to the side of the road, he frantically thought about what to say. He tried to relax his face to avoid showing his fear. The officer approached the car, leaned toward the window and politely asked for his papers. "Your turn signal isn't working, sir," the officer said, eyeing him with professional calm. Alex handed over the documents Carl had left in the car, trying to stay composed, but as the officer compared his face with the documents, he hesitated. "These aren't your documents," the officer said coolly, straightening up. Alex felt his heart pounding even harder. He tried to come up with a plausible story quickly, but his mind was racing. He started to mumble something, but the officer was already suspicious. "Step out of the car, sir." The officer's voice grew more commanding. Alex knew he was out of time. He opened the door, but instead of complying, he tried to run. He dashed toward the nearest alley, hoping to disappear, but the police were prepared for situations like this. "Stop!" shouted the officer, and the sound of running footsteps followed close behind. Alex ran like a madman, looking around desperately for an escape, but his strength was quickly fading. He had spent a month under constant stress, hiding and lying low, and now his body simply couldn't keep up. He could hear the officers closing in and knew he couldn't outrun them. Within minutes, Alex was caught. The officers pinned him to the ground, cuffing his wrists. He struggled, shouting that they didn't understand, that it was a mistake, but deep down he knew that it was over. As they placed him in the back of the police car, Alex realized his flight had come to an end. Everything he had done, every attempt to evade justice, it had all been in vain. He had lost. Soon he was taken to the police station, where he was interrogated. Alex stayed silent for most of the time, but eventually he confessed to everything. He spoke of the deep hatred that had tormented him, of how he had planned Margaret's murder and how a stroke of chance had led to his downfall. Now he faced trial and the inevitable sentence. The trial began several months after Alex's arrest. It was one of those high-profile cases that drew the attention of local media. The double murder of his ex-wife Margaret and the elderly neighbor Mr. Richardson shocked the public. It seemed like a meticulously planned crime, and every step Alex had taken was dissected in the courtroom down to the smallest details. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, friends, and relatives of the victims all came to witness justice being served. Alex sat at the defendant's table, his face expressionless, though at times there was a hint of regret or even panic in his eyes. Throughout the trial, he tried to maintain a cold facade, but the pressure from those around him and the weight of his crimes began to break him from within. The prosecutor described the events of that ill-fated night with striking precision. How Alex had burst into his ex-wife's home, attacked her with a knife, and killed the defenseless neighbor who had tried to help. He presented the court with crime scene photos, witness statements, and even footage from neighbors' security cameras, capturing the moment Alex dragged Mr. Richardson's body into the apartment. It painted a vivid picture of Alex's monstrous cruelty and hatred. Alex's defense tried to portray him as a man driven to desperation, a victim of an emotional breakdown who couldn't handle the aftermath of his divorce. They claimed he suffered from a mental disorder triggered by stress and depression, and that his actions weren't fully conscious. However, the verdict was inevitable. The court couldn't justify a man who had committed such a brutal murder. Alex remained mostly silent throughout the trial. He didn't try to defend himself or ask for forgiveness. Deep down, he knew there was no way back and that his crimes were irreversible. At one point, he even admitted his guilt, stating that regret had come to him far too late. When the sentence was announced, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Alex showed no emotion. He simply sat there, staring into space, as though his body was in the courtroom, but his mind was somewhere far away. The judge declared that his crimes had been cold-blooded and premeditated, and that Alex had shown no remorse throughout the proceedings. The trial concluded, and Alex was sent to prison to serve his life sentence. He knew that his life would now be one of constant isolation, with no hope of freedom. Months passed after Alex found himself behind bars. The first few weeks, he felt an odd sense of calm, as though a weight had been lifted from his soul. He no longer needed to hide. He had already received his punishment. At one point, he even felt this was a deserved penance for everything he had done. However, as time went on, his calm slowly began to dissolve. Each night in his prison cell was like a nightmare. Images of Margaret and Mr. Richardson haunted him, their faces accusing him in silent reproach. He often saw them in his dreams, staring at him wordlessly. These dreams became more and more tormenting. In his cell, Alex spent long hours alone, reflecting on how his life had unraveled. He couldn't understand how a man who once loved his wife could transform into such a monster. He began to despise himself for what he had done. Each day felt like a trial. Prison weighed heavily on him, and thoughts of his crimes gave him no peace. Several months passed, and Alex became more withdrawn. He stopped talking to the guards and his cellmates, rarely went out for walks, and spent all his time in his cell as if trying to hide from himself. At some point, he realized he couldn't live with this burden. No punishment could compare to the pain he felt within. One night, when the prison was asleep, Alex made his final decision. He could no longer bear the torment of guilt and the constant nightmares. He found a way to end his life, using a bedsheet in his cell. The next morning, the guards found his body. Alex had taken his own life, and his death marked the final act in this tragic story. He couldn't cope with the weight of his crimes, and self-destruction became his only way out. After his death, all that remained was emptiness, dark and painful, a reminder of how far hatred and anger can drive a person if left unchecked. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more thrilling and shocking tales. There's plenty more to come. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.